My name is Olivia Carter. For years, I believed that family was unbreakable, that no matter the fight, no matter the hurt, you could always come back home. But that belief shattered the moment my mother slammed the door in my face. Trust me, you'll regret skipping this story. So before you sit back and listen, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to Grace's Truth. Now get in the mood to listen to this story because it might be the ultimate sweet revenge. The cold wind hit my face as I stood on the porch, my heart pounding louder than I ever expected. This was my mother's house, the place I had grown up in where every childhood memory lived between those walls. Yet as I raised my hand to knock, the door swung open just enough to reveal her stern eyes that no longer recognized me as their daughter. "Olivia, you're not welcome here," she said flatly, her voice colder than the autumn air. "Don't come back again." It was the first time she ever spoke to me like that, so final, so unforgiving. I stood there stunned, my suitcase forgotten at my feet. The years of silence between us felt like a wall suddenly solidified into steel. I wanted to scream, to plead, to remind her of all we once were. But nothing came out. Instead, I turned and walked away, the echo of that slammed door ringing in my ears. I never imagined that returning home could feel like stepping into a battlefield. But this was war, a war I didn't want but couldn't avoid. For months, I replayed that moment in my mind, trying to understand what I had done wrong, what unforgivable mistake had led to this exile. Our family had never been perfect, but I believed love was stronger than resentment. I was wrong. I remembered the last phone call we had, the angry words, the accusations. My mother accused me of abandoning the family, of chasing a life that didn't include them. I had left to build a career, to find myself outside the small town where I was suffocating. But she saw it as betrayal. I blamed myself for years, trying to soften the pain, with apologies never heard, with phone calls left unanswered. It was a silent punishment, one that hollowed me from the inside. But beneath the hurt, a flicker of determination was born. One evening, while browsing through a community forum online, I stumbled across a message from someone I hadn't seen in years, a childhood friend who still lived nearby. We reconnected, and unexpectedly, she became a confidant. She reminded me of who I was before the family fractured, and in her encouragement, I found a seed of hope. She asked me a simple question: "What do you really want, Olivia?" I didn't have a clear answer. Was I just longing for forgiveness, or did I want to reclaim something more? That night, I made a choice. I wouldn't just accept my exile. I would fight for my place, not with anger, but with strategy and patience. Something no one expected was about to begin. I began planning quietly. No announcements, no dramatic gestures, just small, deliberate moves. I researched family dynamics, reached out to people who had always been neutral, or distant people who might help bridge the growing divide. I gathered information about the house, the neighborhood, the family history no one talked about. Every step was measured, every conversation weighed. I prepared myself to face resistance. I knew my mother's pride was a fortress, but I was ready to chip away at it, not with force, but with quiet persistence. Weeks passed, and I reached out to my uncle, a man who had always stayed on the sidelines during family conflicts. I was surprised when he responded, not with judgment, but with cautious openness. He didn't take sides. He wanted peace. Our conversations became a lifeline. He shared stories I had never heard about my mother's fears, about old wounds buried deep. It wasn't sympathy, but understanding. And that gave me an edge. I planted seeds of change through him, small truths that hinted at reconciliation without forcing it. It was the first ripple in a still pond that felt ready to shatter. Then I began noticing small victories. My mother's neighbors started mentioning me again. A cousin who once ignored my messages sent a tentative greeting. Each tiny gesture built momentum and anxiety. The family was watching, whispering. Tension rose like an invisible storm. I felt eyes on me everywhere, but I refused to back down. The fight for belonging was a slow burn, and I was prepared to endure the flames. The moment came when I confronted the people closest to my mother, her friends, and confidants. It was not with anger, but with questions that cut deeper than any accusation. Why was I so easily cast aside? What truths were being hidden behind polite smiles? Their resistance was fierce. Some dismissed me outright. Others looked uncomfortable, their loyalty torn. But the cracks in the facade were visible. I pressed on not to win a popularity contest, but to demand recognition of my right to belong. That's when a secret surfaced, a story from the past that explained the bitterness, the rejection, the cold wall between my mother and me. It was a betrayal. None of us had expected, a fracture that had shaped years of pain. Knowing this changed everything. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about healing a wound that had festered too long in silence. Armed with this knowledge, I shifted my approach from pleading for a place at the table to reclaiming my rightful seat. I found a way to step back into the home I thought was forever lost. It wasn't with a key or permission, but with quiet presence and unyielding resolve. I made my mark in small, meaningful ways that no one could ignore. It wasn't easy. The family's reaction was explosive: shock, anger, disbelief, but I stayed steady. I was no longer the daughter who ran away. I was a woman who came back on her own terms. Then, unexpectedly, someone stepped forward, a relative I never expected, offering support. Their gesture was subtle but powerful, shifting the balance in ways I never imagined possible. With allies where I least expected them, the family dynamics began to shift. Walls started to crumble. Faced with a pivotal choice, I decided not to play by the old rules. I chose a path that surprised everyone, including myself. It wasn't revenge nor forgiveness, but a new beginning shaped by my own terms. As I look back on this journey, I see the pain, the anger, the resilience, and the quiet strength that carried me through. I am not the same woman who stood on that porch months ago. This story isn't just about family or home, it's about finding your voice when everyone tries to silence it. Thank you for listening. If this story resonated with you, share your own moments of courage and struggle in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Grace's Truth for more stories that hit close to home. The door slammed shut behind me, but the silence that followed was even louder. I wandered the streets near my mother's home, the cold biting deeper than the autumn air. It wasn't just rejection, it was the fracture of a lifetime of love and memories. I kept asking myself, how did it come to this? When did my mother's love turn into a wall I couldn't climb? The truth lay buried in years of quiet pain. Growing up, I was always the different child, dreaming big, craving more than the small town could offer. My mother, with her old-fashioned views and high expectations, never understood my restless heart. Our arguments started small, but grew bitter, filled with words that cut deeper than knives. I remember the night I told her I was leaving to pursue a career in the city. Her eyes were filled with tears and disappointment. "You're abandoning us," she whispered. That moment marked the beginning of the silence that stretched for years. My phone calls went unanswered. Birthday cards were never sent, and when I tried to visit once, the door remained closed. Each rejection added another layer of hurt, and yet I couldn't give up on the hope of reconciliation. In the weeks after I was banned from returning, loneliness became a constant companion. But amidst the despair, a quiet voice inside me grew louder. I needed to understand, to heal, and if possible, to reconnect. I sought comfort in old letters and photographs, trying to piece together the fragments of a relationship that once was. And then one day, a message popped up on my phone from someone I hadn't spoken to in years, my childhood friend Emily. Emily's words were simple but profound. "I've been thinking about you. Maybe it's time we talked." That message became a lifeline. In her, I found someone who remembered me before the walls went up. Through our conversations, I started to see my mother's side too, the fears and regrets she never voiced. Emily reminded me that healing doesn't always come from confrontation. Sometimes it begins with listening and small steps. Her support gave me the courage to make a plan not for revenge, but to reclaim my place in a family that had cast me out. I began quietly reaching out to relatives who had remained neutral over the years. My uncle, always a man of few words, surprised me by responding warmly. He spoke of the family's fractures and hinted at old wounds no one wanted to face. With each conversation, I gathered pieces of the puzzle. I learned of misunderstandings, secrets, and regrets that had shaped my mother's harsh rejection. Armed with this knowledge, I realized I needed to approach this not as a battle, but as a journey toward understanding and reconciliation on my own terms. So I started laying the groundwork. Small calls, subtle visits, and reaching out to the community around my mother's home. Each step was a test measuring the distance I needed to cross. Sometimes the cold stares and whispered doubts felt unbearable, but the flicker of hope kept me moving forward. I was no longer the scared girl standing on the porch that day. I was a woman determined to rewrite the story of her family, and this was only the beginning. The message from Emily felt like a lifeline thrown into a stormy sea. After years of silence and rejection, someone from my past was reaching out, and it was enough to stir a flicker of hope deep inside me. What started as tentative texts soon blossomed into long conversations that stretched late into the night. In her voice, I heard a reminder of the girl I used to be before the family fractures, before the cold walls went up between us. Emily didn't judge or question my absence. Instead, she listened. She reminded me of dreams and laughter I'd almost forgotten, those precious moments before resentment took root in my mother's heart. Sometimes through our talks, I felt like I was walking back through the years, reliving both the joy and the pain, but more importantly, I was reconnecting with the part of myself that had been lost in the silence. One evening, as we sat on the porch of her modest home, Emily's words cut through the darkness. Olivia, family isn't always about blood or past mistakes. Sometimes it's about who chooses to stand by you when the world turns its back. Her eyes were steady, her voice calm but fierce. Who stands by you when the people who should love you most refuse to? Her words settled in my chest, heavy but somehow freeing. I realized that the fight to return to my mother's home wouldn't be a battle of wills with her. It would be about finding those who still believed in me, who saw me beyond the rifts and wounds. Allies who could help me rebuild what had been broken. I thought of all the people I'd lost touch with over the years, friends, distant cousins, neighbors, those who once mattered, but who had drifted away in the storm of family drama. I decided to reach out, not just to reclaim my family's house, but to rebuild my family's foundation. One name kept coming to mind: Rachel, my mother's next-door neighbor. She had always been quiet, never taking sides, but her kindness was well known. When I knocked on her door, I wasn't sure what to expect. Would she greet me with suspicion or sympathy? To my surprise, Rachel welcomed me with an open heart and no judgment. We sat in her cozy living room, sunlight streaming through lace curtains, and talked for hours. I asked her about my mother, about the family history, about anything that might explain the coldness that had pushed me away. Rachel listened carefully, then shared stories that peeled back layers I had never seen before. She told me about my mother's hidden burdens, losses that no one spoke about, disappointments buried beneath a hard exterior. How my mother's pride had been a shield against fears of abandonment, fears that had hardened into bitterness over the years. Rachel's words made me see my mother not just as a gatekeeper of pain, but as a woman haunted by her own ghosts. This insight changed the way I viewed the whole situation. The rejection wasn't just personal, it was a symptom of old wounds that had never healed. My mother's harshness was a protective armor, but it had become a prison that kept us all apart. Rachel's stories fueled a new determination in me. I wasn't going to fight my mother with anger or desperation. Instead, I would approach this with empathy, patience, and a plan. Over the next few weeks, I quietly gathered information. I delved into family records, talked to relatives who had remained silent, and pieced together stories of betrayals and regrets that stretched back decades. It was like walking through a maze of shadows, but every new discovery helped me understand why the past had been so painful for everyone. One revelation stunned me. I learned of a deep betrayal, one that fractured the family long before I was born. It was a secret no one had talked about openly, but its effects rippled through generations. My mother's distrust and rejection of me suddenly took on new meaning. She was protecting herself and the family from wounds she couldn't heal. Armed with this knowledge, I felt a shift inside me. I was no longer just the daughter begging to be accepted. I was a woman holding the key to a family's hidden past. This gave me power not to punish or shame, but to change the story. With Emily and Rachel as my confidants, I started planning my next steps carefully. I reached out to my uncle again, this time with a clearer purpose and more understanding. He listened cautiously at first, but then with an openness I hadn't seen before. Our conversations became bridges opening doors that I thought were sealed forever. I was careful not to force anything. I knew that any aggressive move would push my mother further away. So I planted seeds of change, small, meaningful gestures and conversations meant to rebuild trust slowly. Sometimes I felt the weight of eyes watching me from the sidelines, the whispers of judgment, the cold stares of old family friends. The tension was like a storm brewing, but I refused to let it break me. Each small victory strengthened my resolve. I learned to be patient with the process, understanding that healing doesn't happen overnight. The journey was about more than reclaiming a house. It was about reclaiming myself and the family I had lost. And then came the moment when I knew I was ready. Ready to face my mother's close circle, to confront the resistance with calm courage, to demand recognition not as a plea, but as a rightful claim. I stood on the edge of a new chapter, knowing that the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in years, I felt hope, a quiet but fierce hope that maybe, just maybe, family could be rebuilt. The night before I planned to take a more direct step toward reclaiming my place in the family, I found myself alone in my small apartment, sitting in the dim glow of a single lamp. The quiet was deafening. Every corner of the room seemed to echo with memories, some comforting, some painfully sharp. I felt the full weight of the journey I was about to undertake pressing down on me. What I was about to do was more than just knocking on doors or reaching out to relatives. It was a move that could either heal years of hurt or fracture what little connection remained beyond repair. The stakes felt impossibly high. I stared out the window at the empty street below, trying to steady my thoughts. Was I ready? Could I face the possibility of rejection again? But beneath all the doubts, a fierce determination burned in my chest. I wasn't going to let the past dictate my future. This wasn't just about a physical place anymore. It was about reclaiming my identity, my worth, and my place within a family that had once been my world, but had become my prison. The decision to reach out boldly was terrifying and necessary. For years, I had been running not just from the past, but from the pain of rejection. Now, I was choosing to stand still, to face it head on. I spent that night preparing more than just a list of names or contacts. I prepared myself emotionally. I wrote down the key messages I wanted to communicate, practicing the calm and composed tone I needed to hold, no matter what the response. I wanted to speak with honesty, but without anger. I wanted to open doors, not slam them. My list was long: cousins who had distanced themselves during family disputes, old neighbors who had witnessed our family's rise and fall, and friends who had once been like family. I studied their social media pages to learn about their current lives and interests, hoping to find common ground for reconnection. It was a delicate dance, too aggressive, and I risked alienating them further. Too timid, and they might ignore me altogether. As I rehearsed my words in the mirror, I reminded myself that this was not just a quest for acceptance, but a reclaiming of the daughter, sister, and woman I still was beneath the scars. The morning light spilled through the curtains as I picked up my phone and dialed my cousin Sarah's number. My heart pounded each ring, stretching into an eternity. When she answered, her voice was tentative, laced with surprise and uncertainty. "Olivia, is that really you?" she asked, disbelief threading through her tone. "Yes, Sarah," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "I know it's been a long time, but I need to talk." Her hesitation softened as the conversation unfolded. I spoke honestly about my desire to understand the past and rebuild bridges. She didn't promise reconciliation or forgiveness, but her willingness to listen was a breakthrough. It was a small but vital victory, a crack in the wall I thought was impenetrable. Over the following weeks, I maintained a steady, quiet effort. Letters written with care, emails sent with hope, and tentative phone calls became my lifelines. Some of my relatives ignored me, others responded with polite distance, but a few reached out with warmth and curiosity. It was as if I was tossing stones into a still pond, watching ripples spread farther than I had imagined. Throughout this process, Rachel and Emily remained my anchors. Their support was unwavering. When doubt and loneliness crept in, they reminded me that healing was a slow, often messy journey, and that persistence was its own kind of courage. Each day, I grew more aware that reclaiming my place was not about a single moment of grand gesture, but a series of fragile, courageous steps. I was learning to accept that rejection might still come, but I would not let it define me. Then came an opportunity I hadn't anticipated, a small gathering organized by one of my mother's close friends. It was an informal event, a chance for the family and their circle to come together. I debated for days whether I should attend. Fear warred with hope. What if I was met with coldness or outright hostility? What if my presence only deepened the divisions, but I knew hiding wasn't an option? If I wanted to be part of the family's life again, I needed to face them not as a shadow, but as a person willing to be seen. On the day of the gathering, I chose my outfit with care. I wanted to look respectful but not desperate, confident but not confrontational. A simple navy blouse, clean lines, soft fabric, something that said I belonged even if they didn't see it yet. Walking up the familiar path to the house felt surreal. The trees were in full bloom, casting dappled light across the lawn where children once played. But the faces waiting for me were strangers now, some curious, some guarded, others openly wary. The room was thick with tension when I entered. I felt eyes on me, some filled with suspicion, others with a faint glimmer of recognition. I took a deep breath and began greeting people with calm politeness. I listened more than I spoke, letting their stories and memories fill the spaces between us. Slowly, as the hours passed, walls softened. Smiles flickered. Stories were shared not of past grievances, but of shared history. I didn't expect a reunion or forgiveness that day. I expected a first step, a fragile thread of connection. That night, walking home under a sky heavy with stars, I felt a shift inside me. Reclaiming my place wasn't a battle to be won with force or fury. It was a delicate dance of vulnerability and courage. It was about showing up even when the outcome was uncertain. I realized my mother's silence wasn't absence of feeling, but a fortress built from pain and fear. To breach it, I needed more than persistence. I needed compassion and understanding. The journey was far from over, but for the first time in years, I felt the stirrings of hope. I wasn't alone. The family, fractured and fragile, was beginning to remember me not just as the daughter who left, but as the woman who had found the strength to return. One evening, I sat on Rachel's porch, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and the soft hum of cicadas. The sky was painted in twilight hues, fading from soft lavender to deep indigo. Rachel looked at me with quiet admiration and said, "Olivia, you're changing the story. Not by fighting, but by being brave enough to stay." Her words settled over me like a balm. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with risks and unknowns, but I was ready to walk it step by step, moment by moment. Because this was more than a journey home. It was a journey to reclaim myself. The days after that small gathering were filled with a cautious optimism I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't naive, I knew the road ahead was still steep and fraught with tension, but for the first time the idea of reconciliation felt within reach. I woke each morning with a quiet resolve ready to keep pushing, to keep rebuilding what had been broken. I began focusing more on the practical side of things. It wasn't just about emotions anymore. I needed to anchor my place firmly in the family's life. That meant reconnecting with people who could bridge the gaps and gently advocate for me within my mother's close circle. It meant showing up at community events, lending a hand where I could, and slowly weaving myself back into the fabric of the neighborhood. One afternoon, I found myself volunteering at the local community center organizing a fundraiser for the town school. It was a small role, but it allowed me to cross paths with familiar faces and new ones alike. I saw how my mother's friends and acquaintances moved through their lives, how their loyalties and fears intertwined. It was a delicate ecosystem, and I was learning how to navigate it without disrupting its fragile balance. My cousin Sarah became a quiet ally. She didn't openly declare her support, but her small gestures, a text checking and a brief conversation at church, a nod of acknowledgement gave me strength. I knew she was walking a tightrope balancing her own fears and loyalties, but every little connection mattered. Behind the scenes, I was also working on another front, the house itself. My mother's home was more than just a building. It was the heart of our family's history. I began researching property records and legal documents, not to challenge ownership, but to understand the dynamics at play. I wanted to be prepared to know exactly where I stood and what options were available. It was a bittersweet process. Walking through old deeds and mortgages, I felt the weight of the past and the future colliding. The house held memories of laughter and tears, secrets and stories. I imagined the walls listening silently, waiting for me to come home. One evening, as I pored over documents in my tiny kitchen, my phone buzzed with a message from Rachel. "I think it's time we talk face to face," she wrote. Her words carried urgency and a hint of caution. I knew this meant she had something important to share, something that could shift the fragile balance even further. We met at a quiet cafe near the edge of town, a neutral place away from the prying eyes of neighbors and family friends. Rachel's face was serious as she slid a folded envelope across the table. "I found this in some old family papers," she said softly. "I think it explains a lot." Inside was a letter from decades ago written in my grandmother's handwriting. It spoke of betrayal and broken promises, of secrets kept to protect reputations, but that ended up dividing hearts. The letter revealed a long hidden rift between my mother and her own sister, a rift that echoed through the generations and shaped how my mother viewed trust and loyalty. Reading those words, I felt the past unraveling like a thread. The bitterness I'd faced was rooted in wounds I hadn't known existed. It was as if the ghosts of family history had taken shape in my mother's rejection of me. With this new understanding, my approach shifted. I was no longer just trying to reclaim a place. I was working to heal old wounds, to rewrite the family's story. I began sharing pieces of what I'd learned with Sarah and a few others I trusted. Slowly, the narrative changed from one of division to one of possibility. But change, even slow and hopeful, always comes with resistance. At the next family gathering, I felt it immediately: the tense glances, the whispered conversations that stopped when I entered the room. My mother herself was distant, her eyes avoiding mine. The past wasn't something you could erase overnight. Still, I stayed calm, steady, refusing to be pulled into old arguments or bitterness. I spoke softly when spoken to, smiled when appropriate, and focused on building bridges rather than walls. The most surprising moment came when my uncle, usually quiet and reserved, pulled me aside. His voice was low but firm. "Olivia, your mother is scared, but so am I. This family has carried pain for too long. You're the first to try and change that." His words were a balm and a challenge. They reminded me that I wasn't alone, that even those who seemed distant shared the burden of family history. Encouraged, I resolved to keep moving forward. Reclaiming my place in the family wasn't about winning a battle, it was about forging a new path, one built on understanding, courage, and the hope for healing. The weeks after that tentative family gathering felt like walking a tightrope. Every step measured, every word weighed. The silence between us was still thick with unspoken grievances, but there were faint glimmers of change. I was learning slowly but surely how to navigate this fragile terrain where past wounds still ached and forgiveness felt like a distant shore. Then one afternoon my phone rang. The caller ID showed a name I hadn't seen in years: Michael, my younger brother. My heart skipped a beat. He'd been as silent as the rest of the family, his absence in my life as painful as my mother's rejection. Hesitantly, I answered. "Olivia." His voice cracked slightly. "Can we meet? I think it's time we talked." The words stirred a whirlwind of emotion, skepticism, longing, hope swirling together in a confusing storm. I agreed, and we arranged to meet at a quiet cafe not far from where I lived. Sitting across from Michael that day, I studied the man who was once my childhood companion, now a stranger burdened by years of distance and silence. His eyes held the weight of regret and uncertainty. "I never wanted things to come between us," he confessed, voice low and hesitant. "Mom's anger. It's like it swallowed the whole family. I felt stuck, caught in the middle, and I didn't know how to fix it." His honesty surprised me, and a fragile thread of hope wove itself between us. "I missed having you in my life," he added softly. That moment, awkward and tentative as it was, became a turning point. For the first time, I saw that rebuilding the family wouldn't be a journey I walked alone. It required others, those who had been hurt, silenced, or caught in the crossfire, to take steps forward, even if small ones. We spoke for hours that day, uncovering memories, acknowledging the pain we both carried, and tentatively dreaming of a future where we could find common ground again. While reconnecting with Michael opened a door I hadn't expected, I also knew that true healing required more than just one relationship. The family was a complex web of connections, and I had to find ways to engage with others who could help me rebuild what was broken. I stepped deeper into the community, volunteering at local events, attending church gatherings, and participating in neighborhood meetings. These weren't grand gestures, but small acts of presence, showing up consistently, offering help, and being willing to listen. At the local community center, I found a role organizing fundraisers and activities for the town's school. It was a humble position, but it allowed me to interact with people who had long been part of my mother's world: neighbors, friends, acquaintances. Some greeted me warmly, others with guarded looks. These moments felt like small stones being dropped into a still pond, creating ripples of connection that I hoped would spread. One evening, Rachel invited me to a dinner with some of my mother's closest friends. The invitation felt like a lifeline, a rare chance to meet the people who had shaped my mother's life, to hear their voices, and perhaps soften the hardened edges of the past. The dinner was held at a modest home, warmly lit and filled with the hum of cautious conversation. As I entered, I felt the weight of eyes, some curious, some skeptical, others quietly welcoming. I spent the evening listening more than speaking, letting their stories and memories weave a new tapestry of understanding. There were moments of laughter, tentative smiles, and surprising warmth, but there were also silences heavy with unspoken truths. Through it all, I realized that healing my relationship with my mother wasn't just about mending one bond, it was about restoring a community that had been fractured by pain and fear. Of course, not all moments were filled with hope. At the next family gathering, old wounds reopened. A long-forgotten argument resurfaced, reigniting tensions that many hoped had faded. My mother's voice was sharp, her disappointment palpable. I felt the sting of her words, the reminder that forgiveness was not something freely given. But this time I did something different. Instead of retreating into silence or defensiveness, I spoke calmly and honestly. I acknowledged the pain we all carried, the mistakes we'd made, and the scars that still lingered. "I know we've all been hurt," I said softly, my voice steady despite the trembling in my chest. "But I believe we can choose a different path, one where we don't let the past define us." The room fell quiet. My words hung in the air like fragile hope. Though no immediate forgiveness came, I sensed that a seed had been planted, a possibility for change. Then, an unexpected ally emerged. My aunt, a woman I had long seen as distant and reserved, stepped forward quietly but with conviction. She approached my mother privately, speaking on my behalf, reminding her of the daughter she once loved and the family they could still be. Her intervention was gentle but powerful. It softened some of my mother's resistance, opening a door I feared was sealed forever. I realized then that sometimes change doesn't come from confrontation, but from unexpected voices willing to speak truth with love. With my aunt's support, the walls between my mother and me began to crumble. We started spending time together, awkward at first, filled with silences and guarded glances, but genuine moments of connection slowly breaking through. We talked tentatively about the past, the hurt, the regrets, and the hopes for a better future. I saw my mother's vulnerability beneath her stern exterior, the fears that had kept her distant for so long. In those moments, I understood that reclaiming my place in the family was not about erasing the past, but embracing it with all its messiness and pain. The journey ahead remained uncertain, but with each step, the walls fell a little more, replaced by bridges of understanding. I wasn't just reclaiming a home, I was reclaiming family forgiveness and the chance for a new beginning. The progress I'd made felt both fragile and profound, like walking a tightrope stretched over a vast chasm. Each step forward was cautious, measured, aware that one misstep could send everything crashing down. The family's eyes were on me, their skepticism palpable, their doubts as heavy as the silence that still filled the spaces between us. But beneath those wary glances, subtle shifts were beginning to take shape. I found strength in the smallest moments, a shared smile, a brief exchange of words, a simple gesture of kindness. These fleeting connections were the threads slowly weaving a fragile tapestry of reconciliation, thread by tentative thread. One afternoon, while helping to set up decorations for a fundraiser at the local community center, I unexpectedly crossed paths with my cousin Emily. We hadn't spoken in years, our lives separated by misunderstandings and unspoken resentments. Yet in that brief encounter, the warmth in her eyes and the sincerity in her voice surprised me. She asked after my life, genuinely curious, and for the first time, I sensed she was open to moving beyond the shadows of our past. Our conversation was short, filled with cautious hope and tentative plans to reconnect. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental, a crack in the wall of distance and silence that had separated us. It was in these quiet, unguarded moments that I began to feel the slow, painstaking work of rebuilding family. The journey was not marked by grand gestures or dramatic confrontations, but by countless small connections, a shared laugh over a memory, a helping hand in times of need, a word of encouragement whispered in passing. Yet beneath this growing warmth, I knew the tension simmered. Old wounds were still raw, hidden just beneath the surface. I moved carefully, aware that my presence still unsettled many. One wrong word, one misplaced action, and the fragile peace could shatter. The hardest encounters were always with the members closest to my mother, her friends and family allies, who had stood by her side unwaveringly. Their loyalty was fierce, and they viewed my return with suspicion, if not outright hostility. To them, I was a reminder of pain, betrayal, and unresolved conflicts. My efforts to reconnect felt like an intrusion into a tightly guarded world they weren't ready to share. At one particularly tense meeting, I found myself face to face with these gatekeepers of my mother's world. I didn't come armed with accusations or bitterness, but with questions that cut deeper than any confrontation. "Why is it so easy to close the door on me?" I asked softly. "What are we all so afraid to face?" Their responses were immediate and unyielding. Some dismissed me coldly, others avoided eye contact, and a few outright expressed hostility. But even in their defiance, I saw cracks, fleeting moments of uncertainty, hesitation, doubt. It was as if the armor they wore was not impenetrable, but brittle, waiting for the right moment to give way. Then, in the midst of this charged atmosphere, an unexpected ally emerged: my aunt, a woman I had long perceived as distant, reserved, and emotionally detached. Quietly, but with remarkable conviction, she began to speak to my mother behind closed doors, advocating for me in ways I never imagined. Her intervention was subtle, but powerful. She reminded my mother of the daughter she had loved, the family they had once been, and the possibility of a future still unwritten. The courage in her voice, combined with her gentle insistence, softened my mother's resistance. With my aunt's quiet backing, the family dynamics shifted. I began to feel the balance tip inch by inch in my favor. It was no longer just about me pleading for acceptance. It was about the family opening doors from within. Emboldened by this new support, I found the courage to assert my presence more openly. I started spending more time at the family home, not as a guest who tiptoed around fragile boundaries, but as a woman reclaiming her rightful place. The process was anything but easy. There were moments of icy silence, of glances filled with unspoken judgment. There were awkward conversations, pauses pregnant with old pain and mistrust. But there were also moments of genuine connection, small conversations that lingered longer than expected, quiet smiles shared over familiar meals, and the warmth of a hand briefly clasped in mine. In those moments, I glimpsed the vulnerable woman beneath my mother's stern exterior, the fears, regrets, and loneliness that had kept her distant for so long. We began to speak hesitantly, cautiously, but sincerely about the past, the pain, and the faint hope for forgiveness. It became clear that reclaiming my place in this fractured family was not about erasing the past, but about embracing it with all its complexity, the messiness, the mistakes, the love, and the hurt. Amid this fragile healing, a long-hidden secret came to light, a truth buried deep in the family's history that explained much of the bitterness and distance. It was a betrayal, old and painful, that had fractured the family foundation and cast long shadows over generations. Learning this secret shifted everything. The rejection I had felt was no longer just personal. It was entwined with wounds that had never healed. This knowledge changed my role from one of pleading for a place to one of helping to heal the family's legacy. I began sharing pieces of this truth with those I trusted, building a network of understanding and support. Slowly, the narrative shifted from one of division and blame to one of shared pain and hope for renewal. Reclaiming my place was no longer just a personal quest. It had become a mission to restore the family's fractured bonds. It required patience beyond my years, empathy deeper than I thought I possessed, and courage that sometimes surprised even me. The path ahead remained uncertain and fraught with risk. But for the first time in a long time, I believed the story of my family could be rewritten, not as a tale of division and despair, but one of healing, resilience, and hope. And so I continued step by careful step, weaving myself back into the family's fabric, ready to face whatever came next with an open heart and unyielding spirit. The deeper I waded into the tangled web of family ties, the clearer it became that the biggest battles weren't fought with loud words or dramatic confrontations. They were waged quietly, in moments of subtle resistance and careful negotiation. The family's close circle, fiercely loyal to my mother, remained wary of my presence. Each time I tried to draw closer, I felt the invisible boundaries they erected. Glances that flickered away, hushed conversations that stopped abruptly, and an unspoken question hanging in the air. Can she truly belong here? One evening, I found myself invited to a small dinner hosted by one of my mother's oldest friends, a woman named Helen. The invitation came unexpectedly carried by Rachel with a knowing smile and a soft encouragement. This could be a turning point. I felt a mix of anticipation and nerves as I prepared to enter a room where every face was a test. The gathering was intimate, a handful of women who had known my mother through decades of joys and hardships. The air was thick with memories, the kind that only time can weave, but also with a cautious curiosity. I was the outsider stepping tentatively into a world that had long shut its doors on me. I spent the evening listening, absorbing stories about my mother that painted her as a woman, shaped by struggles I hadn't fully understood. There were tales of sacrifices made, battles fought in silence, and deep-seated fears of loss and betrayal. Through their words, I saw the fractures in her armor, the human vulnerabilities behind the stern exterior I had faced. We laughed gently over shared memories, and for a moment the walls between us seemed to soften. Yet beneath the surface, the unspoken history lingered, a delicate tension that none of us dared to disrupt fully. The night ended with a quiet invitation to return, a subtle opening I recognized as a gesture of trust. It wasn't forgiveness nor acceptance fully granted, but it was something, a door cracked open just enough for hope to slip through. Back home, the warmth of that evening stayed with me. It reminded me that healing wasn't a destination, but a journey, one marked by incremental steps and fragile moments of connection. Yet just as hope began to take root, the past surged forward with renewed force. At the next family gathering, old wounds reopened with a fury that caught me off guard. An argument sparked by a long-buried grievance flared into the open. Voices rose, sharp words flew, and the fragile calm shattered. My mother's disappointment was palpable, her anger a wall I struggled to breach. The sting of her words was like a slap, reminding me that years of pain couldn't be erased overnight. But this time, something inside me had changed. Instead of retreating into silence or defensiveness, I met her gaze with steady resolve. My voice was calm but firm as I spoke from the heart. "We've all carried this pain too long," I said. "But I believe we can choose a different path, one where the past doesn't dictate our future." The room fell into an uneasy silence. My words lingered like a fragile promise. Though forgiveness was not immediate, I sensed a seed had been planted, a possibility for change that hadn't existed before. In the days that followed, the most surprising support came from an unexpected source, my aunt. Known to many as reserved and distant, she quietly stepped forward to advocate for me in private conversations with my mother. Her words carried weight, her voice a reminder of the daughter my mother once loved and the family they still could be. Her intervention was a turning point. It softened some of the resistance that had kept me at arm's length and opened a pathway I hadn't dared to hope for. With her support, I began to spend more time with my mother. Our moments together were often awkward and filled with pauses, but also with glimpses of the vulnerability beneath her hard exterior. We talked slowly and carefully about the past, the pain, the regrets, the fears. It was not easy, but it was real. Reclaiming my place in this fractured family was never about erasing the past. It was about embracing it, the good, the bad, the messy, and choosing to build something new from the ruins. With each conversation, each shared memory, the walls between us crumbled a little more, replaced by bridges of understanding. The path ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time I believed our family story could be rewritten, not as one of division, but of healing and hope. The family secret I uncovered haunted me like a ghost that refused to be ignored. It was buried deep beneath years of silence and pain, hidden in the shadows of my mother's past, shaping the fractures that had torn us apart. Now that I held this truth, it cast a new light on everything. The bitterness I had felt, the coldness that had pushed me away, the silence that had stretched between us like an endless void. The revelation wasn't just about a single act of betrayal. It was a wound that had festered through generations, a cycle of hurt and misunderstanding that no one had dared to speak about openly. And yet, its presence was felt in every glance, every word left unsaid, every door slammed shut. Holding this knowledge felt like both a burden and a key. I wasn't just the daughter seeking forgiveness anymore. I was the keeper of a fragile truth that could either heal our family or tear it apart completely. It was a responsibility I never asked for, but one I knew I couldn't ignore. I chose carefully whom to share this truth with. Emily was the first, her friendship a beacon in the darkness. Rachel, too, whose kindness had been my refuge. A few other relatives who had always seemed caught in the family's crossfire also needed to know. I shared the secret in quiet, careful conversations, watching their reactions closely. Some were shocked disbelief flickering in their eyes. Others looked saddened, the weight of long-hidden pain settling on their shoulders. And all of them seemed to understand on some deep level the profound impact this secret had on our fractured family. With each sharing, the family's narrative began to shift. The blame and resentment that had dominated for so long started to give way to empathy and a shared desire to heal. It was as though the truth had opened a door not to erase the past, but to finally face it together. But healing is never simple. At family gatherings, I still felt the tension simmering just beneath the surface. Old wounds could flare up unexpectedly, a raised voice, a pointed look, a sudden silence. These moments reminded me that the scars were still raw, that forgiveness was a path strewn with thorns. One particularly difficult evening stands out vividly in my memory. We had gathered at my mother's house, a mix of family and close friends. The air was thick with unspoken emotions, and I sensed the fragile peace could shatter at any moment. Sure enough, an old grievance resurfaced, a long-forgotten argument that reopened the wounds we had tried so hard to hide. Voices rose, harsh words were exchanged, and the atmosphere grew charged with anger and disappointment. My mother's disappointment was palpable. Her words cut deep, like a reminder that the past's weight was not easily lifted. The sting of rejection threatened to engulf me, but something inside me had changed. Instead of retreating into silence or lashing out in anger, I found my voice steady, calm, and sincere. "We've all been hurt," I said quietly, looking around the room. "But I believe we can choose a different path. One where the past doesn't control our future." The room fell into an uneasy silence. My words hung between us like fragile hope, and though forgiveness did not come that night, I felt a seed had been planted. The possibility of change, however small, was now real. In the days that followed, the most unexpected support arrived from a source I had never anticipated: my aunt. She had always seemed distant, reserved, someone who watched from the sidelines rather than stepping into the fray. Yet quietly and with conviction, she began to speak on my behalf. She reached out to my mother, reminding her of the daughter she had once loved, the family they had once been, and the future that still could be. Her words carried weight. Unlike the angry confrontations of the past, her voice was calm, gentle, and filled with the wisdom of years. She spoke of forgiveness, of healing, of the courage it takes to rebuild what was broken. Her intervention softened some of the resistance that had kept me at arm's length. It opened a door that I had long feared was sealed forever. With her support, I found the strength to step more fully into my mother's life again. The walls between us, though still standing, began to crack. We spent time together, often awkward, filled with pauses and uncertain glances, but genuine moments of connection. We started talking slowly and carefully about the past, the pain we both carried, the regrets that weighed heavily on our hearts, and the tentative hope for forgiveness. Reclaiming my place in this fractured family was never about erasing the past. It was about embracing it with all its complexities, its mistakes, its love, and its hurt. It was about learning to hold both the pain and the possibility in the same hands, With every conversation, every shared memory, and every quiet moment, the walls between us crumbled a little more. They were replaced by fragile bridges of understanding and hope. The journey was far from over. The scars were still there, and the path ahead remained uncertain. But for the first time in years, I believed that our family's story could be rewritten, not as one of division and despair, but of healing resilience and love. And so, with hope in my heart and courage in my steps, I continued forward, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that sometimes the greatest strength lies in the willingness to forgive and the courage to be forgiven. The moment I began shifting from reacting to taking control was a quiet one. No grand gestures, no dramatic confrontations. It was the subtle realization that I didn't have to wait for permission or approval to reclaim my place in the family and in my own life. I could start setting the terms defining the space I deserved. That shift wasn't easy. It required me to draw on a reservoir of strength I didn't fully know I had, to stay steady when the family's resistance grew louder, to hold my ground when old wounds were reopened with accusations or cold shoulders. I remember the first time I spoke up decisively. It was during a family meeting convened to discuss some property matters, a meeting thick with tension and unspoken resentments. My mother's voice was sharp, her tone accusing. The old narrative tried to push me aside to remind me I was still the daughter who had walked away. But I interrupted her not with anger but with calm clarity. "I'm here," I said firmly, "not just to ask but to claim my part. Not to fight, but to be recognized." The room fell silent. Eyes widened. The weight of my words hung in the air like a challenge. From that moment, the family dynamics began to shift. I was no longer just the outsider seeking forgiveness, I was a force to be reckoned with. My calm determination earned respect even from those who had doubted me. Alongside the emotional battles, I was also navigating the practical side of reclaiming my place, legalities, paperwork, and conversations with lawyers and financial advisors. The house, the family assets, the inheritance, all were intertwined in a complex web of emotions and obligations. I approached these matters carefully, always mindful of the delicate family dynamics. I didn't want to deepen divides, but to find fair solutions that honored the past and looked to the future. The process was frustrating at times, filled with delays, disagreements, and moments where it felt like progress was impossible. But with each hurdle, I reminded myself of the bigger picture, reclaiming not just property, but my dignity and place. One evening, after a long day of meetings, I sat alone in the family home. The walls around me held memories of childhood laughter, whispered secrets, and long ago celebrations. I felt the weight of history pressing down, but also a sense of belonging I hadn't felt in years. In that quiet moment, I realized how far I had come. From being shut out and silenced, I was now here, present, visible, and determined. The journey was far from over, but I was no longer a victim of the past. I was shaping my future. The sensation of reclaiming my place within the family was bittersweet relief and tension intertwined like stubborn vines. Relief because I was finally where I'd always belonged, yet tension because my arrival unsettled more than it comforted. The family I once knew was fractured, guarded by years of silence and wounds that hadn't fully healed. My presence stirred emotions both raw and complex. At first, their reactions were a mixture of shock, anger, and disbelief. I was the daughter they'd long thought lost the chapter they'd closed to protect themselves from pain. But now, here I was, alive, determined, refusing to be erased. My return challenged their carefully constructed narrative, and I could feel the undercurrent of resistance in every hesitant glance and clipped conversation. Family gatherings became a new kind of trial. The rooms once filled with warmth now held an uneasy air as though old ghosts hovered in the corners. Polite smiles masked deeper discomfort, and beneath the surface old grievances simmered quietly. The laughter was softer, the silences longer. I felt eyes flicker to me before quickly looking away, as if my presence reminded them of things they preferred to forget. Despite this, I remained steady and resolute. I learned to read the unspoken language, the subtle shifts in tone, the avoidance, the guarded questions. Navigating this emotional minefield required patience and grace. I wasn't merely reclaiming physical space in the family home. I was stepping into a new role, one that demanded strength. I was no longer the lost daughter pleading for acceptance. I was a woman asserting her right to be recognized, demanding that the past no longer dictate my future. One afternoon, amidst this delicate dance, I experienced a moment I hadn't dared hope for. My uncle, a man known for his quiet reserve and careful words, approached me with something unexpected, a genuine smile and an apology that came from deep within. "I've been silent for too long," he said quietly, eyes meeting mine with earnestness. "I should have spoken up, stood by you. I'm sorry for the part I played in the distance that grew between us." His words felt like a balm to old wounds, a bridge across the chasm of years. It was a reminder that healing required courage from everyone involved, even those who had remained on the sidelines. His acknowledgement wasn't just about past mistakes, it was an invitation to move forward together. Encouraged by his support, I began reaching out to others' cousins who had kept their distance, neighbors who remembered the family before the silence, friends who had once been close. Each connection was like a thread weaving a safety net that supported my place within this fractured family tapestry. These relationships weren't always easy. Some were tentative, built on years of misunderstandings and hurt. Others were cautious, afraid of reopening old wounds. But slowly, with care and honesty, trust began to grow. Still, not all responses welcomed me. Some family members remained distant, their hearts closed tight against the past. I learned to respect their boundaries without allowing their rejection to define my worth or diminish my place. It was a painful lesson, accepting that not everyone would be ready to heal at the same time. Some wounds run deeper than others, and some bridges may never be crossed. But I chose to focus on the connections I could nurture, the moments of genuine closeness that sparked hope. Shared meals around the family table became sacred rituals. Late-night conversations, once unimaginable, grew into opportunities for understanding. Laughter, sometimes hesitant, sometimes spontaneous, began to fill spaces that had been silent for too long. These fleeting moments formed the foundation for rebuilding trust and family bonds. I held on to those moments fiercely, knowing they were fragile but precious. With every interaction, the family's story was quietly rewriting itself. The dominant narrative of division and estrangement began to soften into one of tentative reconciliation. Eyes that once looked away now met mine with flickers of warmth. Hands that had remained folded in silence reached out in small gestures of connection. Reclaiming my place wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the pain never happened. It was about embracing the full complexity of our shared history, the joys, the betrayals, the mistakes, and the love. It was about learning to carry the scars without letting them define us, choosing to build something new from the broken pieces. The journey was far from over. I knew there would still be days shadowed by doubt, moments of sorrow and setbacks that tested my resolve. But with each step, I grew stronger. With each conversation, I grew closer to the family I'd thought lost forever. I realized that family isn't always perfect or easy. Sometimes it's messy and painful, filled with silence and shouting love and disappointment. But it's also resilient, and I was ready to be part of that resilience. My growing presence in the family was like a stone tossed into still water ripples, spreading, unsettling the delicate balance that had been maintained for years. Each visit I made, each step I took toward rebuilding what was broken, was met with a complex mixture of surprise, suspicion, resistance, and in rare moments, a fragile glimmer of acceptance. It felt as though my return had disrupted an ecosystem carefully nurtured by silence and avoidance, and now everyone was forced to confront emotions they had long buried. I watched closely how my mother's closest friends and relatives reacted. Some clung tightly to the old grievances, their loyalty to her manifesting as cold shoulders, or whispered conversations that ceased when I entered the room. They saw me as an intrusion, a reminder of the fractures they wished had never happened. Their eyes flickered with doubt, and their conversations often pivoted away, as if fearing that any mention of me might reopen old wounds. But beneath the resistance, I sensed a quieter, more complicated feeling: curiosity and, perhaps, even longing. There were moments when someone would catch my eye, then quickly look away, or when a whispered name of mine would travel through the room. It was subtle and unspoken, but I felt the family was watching me, measuring whether I was truly here to stay or just passing through. One particular family gathering brought these tensions to the surface with vivid clarity. It was held in the house that had once been my home, a place filled with memories both sweet and bitter. The room was crowded with faces familiar and foreign, the air heavy with years of unresolved pain. As the evening wore on, the fragile calm shattered. A long-buried grievance erupted like a simmering volcano. Voices rose sharply, accusations cut deeply, and the atmosphere thickened with anger and disappointment. I could feel the old wounds raw and expose the past, rushing in to drown any hopes of peace. My mother's voice was sharp, tinged with bitterness, as she expressed her disappointment not just in me, but in the family as a whole. The words stung like a slap, a reminder that the pain between us was far from healed. The sting of rejection threatened to pull me back into the shadows I had fought so hard to leave behind. But this time, something inside me had changed. Instead of retreating into silence or responding with anger, I met my mother's gaze with a calm steadiness I hadn't known I possessed. My voice was quiet but firm as I spoke from the deepest place of my heart. "We've all carried this pain for far too long," I said. "But I believe we can choose a different path. A path where the past doesn't dictate our future, where we rebuild instead of destroy." The room fell into an uneasy silence. My words lingered between us like a fragile promise, a seed planted in soil, still rough, but ready to grow. Though forgiveness did not come that night, I sensed a shift, a subtle opening of hearts that had long been closed. In the days that followed, I found an unexpected source of support: my mother's oldest and most trusted friend, Mrs. Patterson. She had been a quiet presence through decades of family turmoil, often acting as a mediator in disputes and a keeper of secrets. Her warmth and wisdom had always been a steadying force. One afternoon, she invited me for tea at her quaint, flower-filled home. The moment I stepped inside, I felt the weight of years and unspoken stories resting gently around us. She spoke softly, but with remarkable clarity. "Olivia," she began, "I've watched this family from the sidelines for years. I've seen the pain, the silence, and the walls that have grown between you and your mother. But I also see something else: your strength, your courage to come back." Her words felt like a balm to my weary soul. She encouraged me not to give up, to hold on to hope, even when the path ahead seemed dark and uncertain. "Families are messy," she said, "but love is stubborn. It finds a way even when it seems impossible." Mrs. Patterson's support became a beacon in the storm of emotions swirling around me. She reminded me that healing was not a straight line, but a journey filled with setbacks and breakthroughs, moments of despair, and moments of grace. Encouraged by her kindness, I renewed my efforts to reach out not only to my mother, but to other family members who had remained silent or distant. I sought to listen more than speak, to understand rather than judge. These efforts were met with varying responses. Some welcomed my presence with open arms, eager to rebuild bridges. Others remained cautious, wary of reopening old wounds or being hurt again. And a few, entrenched in their pain, rejected the possibility of change altogether. But I learned to accept these boundaries without letting them define me or my worth. I focused on the moments of connection, no matter how small, shared meals that turned into laughter, late night conversations where old stories were told anew, quiet gestures that spoke louder than words. Slowly, the family narrative began to shift. The story we told ourselves, one of division, betrayal, and loss, was giving way to a new one. It was a story of tentative reconciliation, of fragile hope, of resilience. I saw it in the way eyes that once looked away now met mine with warmth. I saw it in hands that had remained folded in silence now reaching out. I felt it in the unspoken promises woven through our interactions. Reclaiming my place was never about erasing the past or pretending the pain didn't exist. It was about embracing the full, messy truth of our shared history. It was about learning to carry the scars without letting them define us. It was about choosing to build something new together. There were still hard days. Days when the wounds felt too fresh, the pain too sharp. Days when rejection and anger threatened to pull me back into the shadows. But I held on to the moments of light, the small victories, the glimmers of love, the bridges slowly being built. I realized that family is never perfect. It's messy, complicated, and often painful, but it's also resilient, capable of healing and growth if we're willing to try. And I was willing. In the slow and fragile process of rebuilding my family, ties an unexpected force quietly emerged: my aunt. For years, I had seen her as distant, reserved, and emotionally detached, someone who observed rather than participated, who kept her feelings locked away behind a composed exterior. She was not the kind of woman who sought the spotlight or stirred the waters. But beneath that calm facade there was a strength and wisdom that few truly recognized. It began with small gestures, a call, a note, a quiet word in private conversations. My aunt started reaching out to my mother with a gentle but firm persistence. She reminded my mother not only of the daughter she had lost, but of the woman I had become. More importantly, she spoke of forgiveness not as a sign of weakness, but as an act of courage. She urged my mother to consider the possibility of healing, to let go of the burdens of old grievances, and open her heart to reconciliation. Her advocacy carried weight. My mother, who had long been guarded and resistant, began to listen in ways she hadn't before. The walls that had surrounded her heart, built from years of pain and fear, started to show cracks. It wasn't a dramatic transformation, no sudden flood of forgiveness or tearful embrace, but a subtle softening. A door once firmly shut was now slightly ajar. With my aunt's quiet but steady encouragement, I found myself spending more time with my mother. Our moments together were often awkward, filled with hesitant glances and long silences. We tiptoed around the painful history between us, wary of triggering old wounds. But even in the hesitancy, there were glimpses of something new: tentative warmth, fragile vulnerability, and a growing willingness to connect. Our conversations began to stretch longer, moving from superficial topics to more meaningful exchanges. We started to speak haltingly at first about the past, the pain we had both carried in silence for so long, the regrets that shadowed our lives. It was uncomfortable, raw, and sometimes painful, but it was real. I saw beneath my mother's stern exterior a woman weighed down by fears, fears of loss, fears of betrayal, fears that opening herself to me again might bring more hurt. But alongside those fears, I sensed a dawning realization that healing was possible, that the family we had once been could be found again, even if only in pieces. We didn't resolve everything at once. There were moments when the old tensions resurfaced, when silence returned like a heavy fog. But with each conversation, no matter how tentative, we built a fragile bridge across the chasm that had divided us. At the same time, the story of our family was quietly evolving. The narrative that had dominated for years, one of estrangement, blame, and resentment, began to shift toward one of resilience and hope. More family members started to reach out, some tentatively, others more openly, extending hands of reconciliation. Shared meals became more frequent. The table, once a place of division, grew warmer with the presence of laughter, sometimes hesitant but genuine. Old stories, long buried and left unspoken, were brought into the light, not to reopen wounds, but to foster understanding and connection. The family gatherings, which had been filled with tension and distance, began to hold moments of genuine joy and togetherness. It was as if the fabric of our family, once frayed and torn, was being carefully rewoven thread by thread. Yet the journey was far from smooth. Old hurts and grievances surfaced unexpectedly like shadows emerging in the dusk. Sometimes a careless word or an unresolved tension threatened to unravel the progress we had made. There were nights when frustration and sorrow overwhelmed us, when the weight of the past felt too heavy to bear. But each time, we chose to try again. We chose to face the pain, to speak the truths that had been silenced, and to reach for one another even when the path was uncertain. I learned that reclaiming my place in this family was not a destination, but a process, a slow, unfolding journey of trust, forgiveness, and acceptance. It required patience beyond measure and a willingness to embrace vulnerability. As I look back on this chapter of my story, I see not just the struggles, but the remarkable courage of those who dared to hope. My aunt's quiet strength, my mother's tentative steps toward healing, and the willingness of family members to let go of the past, all of these became the foundation of a new beginning. Our family was no longer perfect, nor would it ever be, but it was alive, growing, and healing. And in that fragile, beautiful transformation, I found a sense of peace, not the peace of forgetting or erasing pain, but the peace of choosing love in spite of it. The days that followed my aunt's quiet intervention marked a subtle but undeniable shift in our family's atmosphere. It was as if a long-held breath had finally been released, allowing room for tentative hope to take root. Yet the path ahead remained uncertain, littered with fragile emotions and cautious steps forward. I spent more time with my mother, learning to navigate the delicate dance of rebuilding trust. Our conversations were often punctuated by silences heavier than words, but they were real moments, glimpses of vulnerability shining through the cracks in her armor. It was in these fragile spaces that I began to understand the depth of her fears and the pain she had carried alone for so long. One afternoon, we sat together on the porch of the family home, the sun casting long shadows over the garden where we had once played as children. The air was thick with unspoken memories, and I broke the silence gently. "Mom," I said, "I know there's been so much hurt between us, but I want you to know I'm here, not just as your daughter who left, but as someone who wants to heal with you." She looked at me, eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've been scared, Olivia," she whispered. "Scared of losing you again, scared of opening wounds that might never close." Her words echoed the fears I had felt myself, the fears that had kept us apart. In that moment, I reached out and took her hand, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. It was a beginning, not perfect, not complete, but a start. The family's narrative continued to evolve slowly, shedding the layers of pain and misunderstanding that had defined us for so long. More family members stepped forward, reaching out with tentative hands of reconciliation. Shared meals became occasions for laughter and storytelling rather than tension and silence. Yet amidst these hopeful signs, old wounds sometimes resurfaced, reminding us that healing is never linear. During a recent family gathering, an argument erupted unexpectedly, fueled by years of unresolved grievances. Voices were raised and tears were shed, but rather than fracturing us further, the confrontation became a catalyst for deeper understanding. We spoke openly about the hurt we had caused one another, the mistakes made in anger and fear. It was painful but necessary, a reminder that true healing requires facing the darkness as well as embracing the light. In the quiet moments that followed, I found myself reflecting on the journey we had undertaken. From the depths of rejection and silence, we were slowly weaving a new story, one of resilience, forgiveness, and renewed connection. I realized that reclaiming my place in the family was about more than just physical presence or legal recognition. It was about reclaiming our shared history, embracing both the scars and the love that bound us together. As the sun set over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the family home, I felt a sense of peace I had not known in years. The road ahead would still be challenging, but for the first time, I believed in the possibility of a future where our family could heal and grow. And in that hope, I found strength to keep moving forward. The journey that had begun with a slammed door and years of silence was finally reaching a place I once thought impossible, a fragile new beginning. I sat quietly in the living room of the family home, the very place that had once felt like a prison, now suffused with soft afternoon light and the faint hum of distant laughter. It was a moment to reflect, a moment to breathe, and to understand what I had learned through every heartbreak and every step forward. Looking back, the story of my return wasn't just about reclaiming a house or a place at the family table. It was about reclaiming myself. I had stepped out of the shadows of rejection and into the light of my own strength, courage, and resilience. I had learned that family is never perfect, never simple. It's a complex tapestry of love and hurt, forgiveness and pain, silence and spoken truths. And yet, despite everything, it is worth fighting for. The healing didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, painstaking process filled with moments of joy and sorrow, triumph and setback. There were days when the wounds seemed too deep to mend, when silence returned like a heavy fog. But there were also days when laughter filled the rooms again, when conversations flowed freely, and when old hurts softened enough to allow new memories to grow. In those quiet victories, I found hope. My mother and I continued to rebuild our relationship, one conversation at a time, one moment of vulnerability after another. She shared stories of her fears and regrets, the burdens she'd carried alone for so long. I shared my own pain and hopes. We discovered that beneath years of hurt, the love we had for each other had never truly disappeared. It was just buried, waiting for the right moment to be uncovered. The family around us began to change as well. Cousins who once kept their distance came closer. Friends became extended family. The bonds that had been strained by time and trauma began to mend. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be, but it was real. There were still disagreements and misunderstandings, but now they were met with a willingness to listen and to forgive. We learned that rebuilding family is not about erasing the past, but embracing it fully, acknowledging the scars while choosing to move forward. Reflecting on this journey, I realized the greatest lesson I'd learned was about the power of resilience. No matter how deeply a family is fractured, no matter how long the silence, there is always a chance to heal if we have the courage to try. And sometimes that courage means standing alone, believing in yourself when others do not. It means choosing hope over despair, love over bitterness, and action over resignation. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the house in warm golden light, I felt a deep sense of peace. I was no longer the girl left out in the cold. I was a woman who had fought her way back, not just to a home, but to a family, to love, and to herself. This story is not just mine. It is the story of anyone who has ever felt abandoned, rejected, or silenced by those they love. It is a story of hope and the quiet strength it takes to reclaim what was lost. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share your own journey in the comments. Your voice matters, and your story could be the light someone else needs to find their way home. And don't forget to subscribe to Grace's Truth for more stories of resilience, healing, and the complex beauty of family. Thank you for listening.